Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming so early in the morning on a weekend. We're expecting everyone to fill in by afternoon. We'll have an afternoon session when the 30 speakers you'll hear now will be narrowed down to 6, divided into two teams of 3 and 3 each. And then it'll be a parliamentary style debate. I'd just like to introduce our guests, our judges for the first round, which is narrowing the 30 down to 6. We have Deepanjana Pal, managing editor of Newslaundry. Thank you, Deepanjana, for taking the time. Anand Ranganathan, a scientist and consulting editor for Newslaundry. Thanks, Anand. The rules are there in front of you. I'll quickly get off stage. I just would like to remind our contestants that when you come onto stage, please introduce yourself, your full name, the college you're from, and the motion you're speaking for or against. I repeat, please don't forget to introduce yourselves because there will be no introduction to you, to your college, or to your motion by any other usher. So good luck to everybody. We hope to listen to 30 really smart and well-articulated points of view. Good luck to all of you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ahona. I'm from Jadavpur University. And my motion is movements based on gender identity have no place in modern society. And we have Virat Kohli on the ground, high elbow, head straight, and there's a six straight to the skies. How many of us have noticed that cricket commentaries are done in stereotypical aggressive tones? They are done because these aggressive tones entice the male audience. How many of us realize that modern society uses this as a litmus test to select a gender for sports? Good morning, respected jury and members of the House. I am here to speak against the motion because I believe that modernization of society entails the evolution of thought, and that can only happen through movements that challenge stereotypes. It was a movement of 37,000 people that caused Britain to look at the case of Alan Matheson Turing, the premier mathematician who was convicted due to homosexuality and driven to suicide. It was a social media storm that challenged people who sniggered at Ellen DeGeneres for coming out of the closet. Now, because of these two movements, is it automatically implied that social reform has been done with, it's completed? On the contrary, modernization is a dynamic and movements maintain modernization. Out of all of you sitting over here, how many of you are Potterheads, love Harry Potter? Remember in Philosopher's Stone, there was a scene where Dudley he's furious because he got 36 presents on his birthday, but previous year he had 37. Modern society is much like Dudley because all they are saying is that 36 feminine females and masculine males, but last year I had 37. Like a child that ought to be disciplined, modern society needs to be taught to forget previous year's statistics and orthodox thoughts. Because my identity does not depend on my biology, it is constructed by my choices. Judith Butler, an American gender theorist, postulated in 1998 that society cages the human spirit by assigning us gender portfolios. And fighting against these portfolios becomes all the more important in a country like India because India has 377 issues with gender identity. Now, these are huge scales that I'm talking about. Let's talk about smaller ones. Ever bought a Kinder Joy or taken your child to McDonald's? Ridiculous questions are asked there. Ma'am, do you want a toy for a boy or a girl? This is society's master plan, to snatch away from your child the choice of identity by telling them that even their toys have gender. And the problem lies in the fact that society just cannot accept that male and female are not two completely dissociative identities. Need reference? Class 12, NCERT Biology, Chapter 6, 7th edition, page number 86. To eliminate male from female, you need to eliminate the entire human race because we share chromosomes, hormones, desires. Even jobs are a monopoly of genders. Furthermore, paternity leaves are unheard of because apparently fathers don't want to care for their children or their babies. To me, this doesn't sound like the relationship between man and society. It rather sounds like the relation of master and slave. And we must fight against these slavery with rebellion. And because all changes begin with yourself, I pledge here that I won't judge. I won't judge if a man cries at the end of Titanic. I won't judge if my little brother wants to become a princess. I won't judge if a woman finds me attractive. And even though all of you might not be aware of it or yourself, you are with me in this fight against stereotypes, because the first thing in debates is challenging stereotypes. So because you're here to debate, you are challenging them, and I am saluting your effort and your courage. So well done, guys. Well done. Thank you, everyone.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Shaurya Chaturvedi from Bitspilani, Hyderabad, and the motion on the floor of the House today is that movements based on gender identity have no place in the modern society, and I'm speaking for the motion. Balls. That's how we define masculinity today. That's the idea that we have propagated over the years into the children that have been raised in the last 10 years. First of all, before we move into whether this is right, whether I should be standing for the motion or against the motion, the question here is that what is gender identity? What is a movement? And what is a modern society altogether? Now, gender identity is supposed to be a person's personal and subjective experience of one's own gender, how they feel about themselves. It's not binary. It's not black and white. It's a gray area. It has multiple shades. It's an entire spectrum altogether. Now, movements. Now, today, a large-scale uproar within the society that is driven by a communal feeling, something which is common, something that a section of the society feels, so that they can highlight an underlying issue which has been neglected over the past period in the society. And its effect, or its intended effect, is effectively to change the legal, governmental, societal setup of our community. And the last part is the modern society. What is the modern society? I believe it's just a simple Western propaganda. How can you define what a society is? How can you classify it as something modern altogether? The Western society, with its various doctrines, policies, and procedure, says that those are supposed to be the benchmarks of the modern society. Now, clearly, what I'm saying today is not that gender identity is wrong, or feeling differently from what the sex that you have been assigned is wrong, because gender altogether is a different term. But the fact is that movements altogether were directed towards a noble cause for creating empathy, awareness about a particular issue. But over the period, most of them, or a majority of them, have offshooted into a method of empowering a particular section. So is empowering wrong, is what I ask. But the problem is that a motion shouldn't be empowering a particular community, because it's not only about that particular section of the society which raises that particular question, but rather also the people who are denying those rights to the others. It's as much as the person who's standing on stage, as much as it's about the people who are listening to him. Once you declare that a motion is something related to gender identity, or for that matter, feminism, or anything else, what you're essentially doing is alienating all the other people from it. A movement is supposed to bring out equality. People are fighting for neutrality in our society. People are fighting for equal rights to men and women. People not being judged on the basis of their sexual orientation. How exactly are you, or one who says that gender identity movements are important, is going to ever achieve that goal if he keeps on going and blabbering about how they need certain rights and proposals need to be put forward in the legal clause? The fact is that if you go ahead extending this gender identity, which cannot even be defined in a concrete manner, because the boundaries for the same are not set, how do you even know who's standing for the motion, who's standing against it? What you end up doing in any motion, for that matter, which is targeted or is brought up by a certain section of the society, is alienating the others altogether. So what is needed is not a movement driven by gender identity or people who identify with the cause, but a bigger motion, a bigger movement in order to actually bring about equality. Just plain simple equality, not judging people on the basis of the gender identity, they're being feminist, not feminist, or whatsoever. Just plain and simple equality. There was a very simple thing that once was quoted by one of the lesbian activists. That she said, once a journalist asked her that, why do you fall in love with the same sex? And she simply said that I don't fall in love with the genitals, but the person's soul.
Hi, my name is Anmol Agarwal. I'm Ahmedabad, and I'll be speaking against the motion that states that movements based in gender identity have no place in modern society. So here's how I'm going to go about my speech. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify a few definitions for you guys, and then I'm going to try and define status quo, and with the help of that, I'm going to try and identify what the need for such movements are and what the society will work towards in the absence of such movements. So the first thing that I'd like to set context to is what modern society exactly is. Right now, there's a innate difficulty in defining that because it's such a dynamic concept. So today, modern society might be me standing here as a girl in pants and talking to you, whereas before independence, modern society in India would be a girl wearing pants in the first place. So modern society in itself is something that changes over time, and we apprehend that it will change over time. Given the dynamic nature of modern society, if we pick up a particular point in time for today, for example, today, there are two broad ways in which we can define modern society. One would be the utopic manner in which there's perfect gender equality, in which if a person is gay, they have just to say that they're gay and they're perfectly accepted, where there's job equality, where there's equality in every sphere of life. The other way of defining this is reality, wherein having a gay best friend is like having a fashion accessory. Abhishek Bachchan doing random things, running around like a gay person is something that sets the hall into riots of laughter. This is what reality is. It's riddled with stereotypes and biases, and these are things that are very, very different from what the utopic situation is. Having said this, having given these two characteristics of modern society, there are two types of changes that need to take place. One is the vertical change, in which a society needs to move from what it is today to what it should be tomorrow. And the other sort of change is the horizontal change, in which it needs to move from what it is today to what it should be in utopia. And what movements for gender identity do is allow both these changes. And I'm going to tell you how. Now, the first change, that of moving from reality to the utopic situation. What happens is, so as I identified, there are a lot of areas in which reality is lagging behind utopia, right? And what a movement does is, first of all, it follows like a four-pronged process. What it does, it starts by generating awareness about the issue. Then it moves on to mobilize the people who are interested in the issue and who feel strongly about it. It connects them, and especially in today's world, mediums like social media, etc. It connects these people and allows them to act as a whole rather than as an individual, which allows them to have a greater impact on the parameters that they're trying to change. So, for example, if they're trying to change a particular law, going together in a body, going as a movement rather than as an individual, will have a stronger force in impacting the change that's required to move from now to what ideally should be the situation. Now, there's another sort of effect that movements do have, and this is more of a long-term effect. So today, if there's a strong movement for gay rights, tomorrow if my child turns out to be gay, he will not have any scruples in telling me that fact, knowing that there is a large support group in the world at large that will support him in his identification, right? So this is another thing that movements do allow. Along with that, they will generate a greater acceptance towards various gender identities within the society at large. So this is how lateral movement takes place. Now, about forward movement, what we need to identify here is that gender identity is a very fluid concept. So if about 200 years ago, gender identity was defined by what a girl should and should not do, today, gender identity has moved on from being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, to being neutrois, being agender. It's just, there are so many different ways in which people are identifying their gender that sticking to one particular definition limits the entire society and says that this is what you're sticking to. Now, moving on to what the impact will be if gender fluidity, gender identity movements are not allowed. It's basically like telling society that we're going to tie a blindfold around you and we're going to tell you that status quo is best. There's absolutely no need for change.
Good morning. I'm Shrikat Bhattacharya. I'm from IIT Madras. And I'm speaking against the motion that this House believes that movements based on gender identity have no place in modern societies. Well, let's first get on with the definitions. What's gender? Gender is related to sex sometimes, not always. Sex essentially is basically at the very core of it, down to the genitalia and the chromosomes and the DNA and all of that. But gender is more than that. It's basically that combined with the fact how society expects you to behave or how society treats you or how the expectations in society has been set in stone based on previous examples. Now, in modern society, you can say that a lot of good has happened, that a lot of acceptance has come. And in any civilized society, as time goes by, as we get even more and more civilized, there is an increase in tolerance. There is an acceptance of different views of what you want to be, of what you choose to be. And it is accepted as a fact that gender is just more than male and female, and it lies on the spectrum. It's not just male, it's not just female. And there have been introduction of new laws and the implementation of which is somewhat patchy, but at least there has been a step forward. But can we truly look ourselves in the mirror and say that we really have enacted a big change? Can we really say that there is no discrimination, or even there is very little discrimination? We can't, because if you come out of the closet as anything, as say transgender or gay or bisexual or lesbian or whatever it might be, you will be labeled as a freak and as a weirdo. And good luck living a life like that. Acceptance still hasn't come, and this hasn't come even in the so-called developed, advanced Western societies. In India, if you come out of the closet, good luck with the rest of your life. It's quite difficult. And I've written a lot of points, but since this issue is close to my heart, I'm not going to read from here. I'm just going to tell you about a personal anecdote. I come from IIT Madras, as I said. There's this group called Vandam there, which is an LGBTQ group, and I know some of the people there. And especially one of my very close friends on campus is a person who is transgender, who was born female, but identifies as male. And initially, I remember there was a pronoun confusion, as it tends to be. And I asked him, should I call you she or should I call you he? And then he said, please call me he, because that is what I choose to identify with. And that is why I say he, because at the end of the day, it's not, and it shouldn't be what society wants to call us. It should be what we want to identify as. I find this almost borderline disgusting that someone can tell me that, okay, you cannot be this or you cannot be that simply because this hasn't existed before, and I'm uncomfortable with the fact that you may choose to identify in this way. And believe me, homophobia, transphobia, this is a very real thing in modern society. Finally, I would just like to end with this fact that the only thing that we truly, really desire is a freedom to choose to be who we want, don't we? Thank you.
My name is Abhishek Gore. I'm from IIT Bombay, and I'm speaking against the motion. This house believes that movements based around gender identity have no place in modern societies. Gender is an integral part of an individual's identity. In order to enable everyone to live their lives with dignity and equality, it is important to recognize the different ways in which a person's gender impacts their life. We think this can be best achieved through movements based around gender identity. What these movements mean is that these movements would focus on solving problems faced by one particular gender, like for example, groups seeking affirmative action for women, right? We think this method of achieving equality is far better than the alternative, which is to imply gender-blind policies or policies which seek to do this in a gender-neutral way. For example, having anti-discrimination laws which do not actually account for the barriers that gender places in your way to achieving progress, right? I'll place two arguments before you in this debate. Firstly, as to how we can achieve social progress more effectively through this, and secondly, how these movements help people identify and self-actualize by serving as forums. Coming to the first argument and the first part of it, how it becomes much harder to fight for important issues that are gender specific, right? We think that when you have a movement that is gender neutral, that does not talk about specific problems faced by a particular gender, you prioritize problems faced by both genders and focus on solving them. You do not address important issues that need to be addressed in a very gender sensitive way. For example, right now women face the threat of sexual assault, and patriarchal norms tell them how they're supposed to live their lives for like practically the entirety of their lives. Men are expected to live up to patriarchal stereotypes of being aggressive and masculine, which they can't break out of. Transgenders aren't even allowed to even use the bathrooms that of the gender they identify as, while people who don't conform to the gender binary aren't even like accepted for their identity and are rejected and called as being freaks or deviants, right? For all these issues, you need gendered movements to solve these problems. You need gender-specific movements bringing out attention about these issues, which is the only way to solve this, right? But even if a gender-blind or a gender-neutral approach achieves some form of equality, even in those fields, it's likely that this equality is superficial. How would that be? Firstly, we think that when genders form barriers to your progress, the problem with gender-neutral approaches is that they fail to recognize how these kinds of gender roles can form barriers, right? For example, a gender-neutral approach would push for anti-discrimination laws and think the problem is solved, right? Without acknowledging that women maybe face much higher barriers to enter education, to enter politics, which is why like this kind of equality is largely superficial. If you want true equality, you need to fight for affirmative action for women, to fight against stuff like the pay gap, which means that even if, say, women are able to ever reach the same position as men and we think the problem is solved, it's likely that they're seen as less competent, it's likely that they're seen as dominant or assertive in their nature and not something that wouldn't be applied to men in that first place. It's likely that they don't get stuff like maternity leave and they are forced to choose between having a family or sacrifice their career, which means that even if you achieve equality in some forms, it's not absolute, it's not true equality. Coming to my last argument on how these gendered groups follow and function and allow for identification and self-actualization. We think for your identity to matter, it must have space to grow and interact with others. These movements are not just for achieving social progress, but also serve as a space for people to identify with others of their own and gender, also allow for them to form that identity, that group identity, which allows them to grow in different ways. For example, a woman feels much more comfortable discussing issues and problems that she faces, which she has common with other women than she would in a woman-specific forum than she would doing that around men, right? Which means that you need these specific forums for every person to be able to identify clearly and for every person to be able to grow in these fields, right? We think on our side of the house, we achieve true equality, we achieve gender-sensitive outcomes which make things really equal, and self-actualization through these forums for all. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Good morning, I'm Shruti Y from Mount Carmel College, and I'm going to be opposing the motion this House believes that movements based on gender identity have no place in modern society. Can I start? Okay. So in today's society, the definition of a modern day society is incredibly hard, right? But we can try to define it. The existence of a concept like global citizenship or international coexistence is something that defines our thought process in today's modern society. We live across cultural, ethnic, political, sociological, scientific, and philosophical barriers. We understand that we exist within a framework of laws and the provision of policy, but we also realize that the human touch is required in order to provide us with unique solutions to various issues that occur within our society. Now, given that I have said this, we realize that gender identity comes on a spectrum. It is not just a man and a woman, and therefore there are unique problems that exist to both norms as well as to every individual who exists in between. For this, I have two constructives. I'm going to be talking about the normalization of the other or othering, the concept of othering which occurs in society, as well as the policy frameworks and how we need to work on them in order to be a very inclusive and a very open-minded society, and why movements on gender identity are very important in this front. To begin with, the representation in any society is generally based on political power or the person who has the most strength. Traditionally, we realize that identities are innate and unique, but we still seem to define them as either men or women. Today, there's a fluidity of gender identification, and because of this, the double differentiation where you have the white man who is a center of power and the black woman who is a double differentiated other. But you also have an entire section of individuals who do not identify as either man or woman, who exist as both black and white women, who are not even considered within the spectrum of of association. Because of this, we realize that this other norm, this individuality which we're not too familiar with, is considered to be the abnormality, where the woman is the other of the man, the stranger is the other of the native, and apparently a gender fluid individual is supposed to be the other of a gender normative individual. Because of this, what we're doing is we're de-recognizing the individual's personal classification of an identity which is very, very different from his or her biological sex. Now, where does policy come into this? Groups typically define themselves in relationship to others, right? So if you do not have a majority, you will not have a minority, and vice versa. If you do not have a minority which is facing certain issue, you will never have a norm which has rights which are not stolen from them. Because of this, we realize that the definition and the relationship between the self and the other comes with a lot of rewards and punishment that are both symbolic and materialistic by nature. We realize that groups do not identify simply with the self or with the other, and those who do not identify as either the self or the other have issues in policy framework that are very misrepresented and misdiagnosed. For example, if I am to represent someone from a fluid gender who has a fluid has a gender fluid representation of himself or herself, I will, even though I am representing them, as long as they do not represent themselves in modern day policy frameworks and in modern day governance, there will never be a breaking of the hierarchy. To conclude, I would like to remind everyone of the identity of an outcast, or the policy measures that are required in order to break this particular this barricade. If you do not allow them to discuss their rights and policies and create them based on not create them based on recommendations of a person who is from the normative category, but allow them to be created based on their own identity and their own issues and their own participation actively in policy making, the idea of gender fluid individuals existing in a society is not going to be there. For all these reasons, I believe that various movements that exist in self-identification, regardless of whether they are based on sexual identity or gender identity, have a huge impact in modern day society and have a huge impact, more importantly, on our policies and frameworks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suyash Chandak, a student of IIM Ahmedabad, and I'm going to speak against the motion that nationalization of banks is a recipe for corruption and favoritism. News like State Bank of India extending loans to Adani Group, or banks underwriting writing off loans of various groups is nothing new. We have always been listening to these kind of news, and they always talk about the corruption involved with these banks. But have we ever noticed that the news which we hear is always about state banks, or always about nationalized banks? We never hear about what was the role of Kotak in the DLF scandal. Why does that happen? It only happens because the opposition wants to use these kind of news points to target the government, and hence in the long run we start ignoring news relating to corruption in private banks. So and let's look at the other side. What this makes us believe is that corruption cannot exist in private banks, and corruption happens only in nationalized banks. But is it that the case? There are a lot of examples of nationalized banks which are corruption-free. Look at what has happened in Iceland post-2010. What is Temasek, the manager of Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, has been doing it on for years? What is European Investment Bank doing? These banks are completely transparent and are corruption-free. On the contrary, for that matter, the corruption in Iceland has reduced after the nationalization of banks. So this makes me wonder, what is the root cause of corruption? Is it the nature of the bank, as in private or nationalized, or is it something else? These examples clearly show that it's not the nature of the bank, but rather the environment in the country. How corruption is perceived. Is corruption acceptable? Are there systems and laws in place? Are these enforceable? And hence, corruption in banks is not a function of the nature of the bank, but rather the nature of the country. Moving on, let's look at what's the other side. Like what happens if we don't nationalize banks? Banks would remain privatized, right? And like in any industry, private players start getting together, and then they get together and they start fighting for their rights, which we call lobbying. And lobbying itself is a form, it can be called as a form of corruption, right? And when they lobby for rights. But these rights are not for the owners of the banks, but rather for the agents of the banks, rather as in the managers, So, and a good example of this is when a lot of American investment banks lobbied to get the Steel Act repealed and got the Gramm-Leach Act in place of it. Gramm-Leach Act, as we all know, was the foundation for the global financial crisis. So all in all, what essentially the case is that the level of corruption is not a function of the nature of the bank, but it's the nature of the country, and also private players may, in way, because of their lobbying, and may actually increase corruption. Thank you.
I'm Jibran Mansoor, a student from Ashoka University. I'll be speaking on the motion, this house believes that government having ownership in banks is a recipe for corruption and favoritism. I'll be for the motion. Can I begin? Yeah. So at the onset, let me establish the two themes that I'll be fighting this debate on. The first theme is, what does it mean to have an ownership or invest as an entity, even if it is a government? The second theme is, what happens when government invests? How does corruption and favoritism come about, and why is it intrinsically problematic in nature? For the first theme, let me argue that in a capitalist system, wherein every person is for himself, when an entity starts investing or starts owning something, it expects returns, right? It acts out of self-interest, it takes all means necessary and expects the profits to keep on inflowing. So this contractual polity, that is the state, it acts out of a colored perspective and starts investing into this particular area, right? So as soon as it starts investing, its focus from the societal benefits shifts to a focus of a private gaining coming back into the state. As soon as it does that, it automatically shifts from being a public agent to an instrument of a private entity, trying to maximize its profits and hence dilutes the contractual obligations that it was running forward for. The second theme which I fight for is what happens when a government invests and why does it go wrong. I argue on two fronts over here. The first one is about favoritism, right? So in order to understand how favoritism works, let us understand what the absence of favoritism means. In the absence of favoritism, a competent judge makes an objective decision without being attached to any kind of a self-interest motivation, right? So for an example of the same will be that when a government has decided which banks to bail out, for example, under the Economic Exploitation Act of 2008, when the US housing crisis was going on, the government had a conscious decision to make on which bank to bail out. And in that scenario, a binary objective decision has to be made and not a decision made by colored perspectives on what the government has an equity in, right? So the favoritism in this particular scenario fails because as soon as a state becomes or attaches itself to some kind of a self-interest by inducing some kind of equity in certain banks, it automatically stops being a competent judge, going back to the million understanding of what a competent judge is, because a competent judge necessarily acts without any kind of self-interest prevailing within the ambit of the decision, right? So for an example of the same will be in the Swedish housing crisis of 1991, wherein the government of Sweden made an active conscious decision of only bailing out those banks in which the government had an equity in. So as soon as the government decided to make a decision out of self-interest, it automatically reduced 10% of potential growth that could have been seen after the housing crisis, which was necessarily a bad decision for the government to make, and hence ties up to the idea of how favoritism is an inevitable cause because you stop being a competent judge. The second front that I argue this debate on is the idea of corruption, right? So in the idea of a state owning some kind of a bank, a state becomes a Weberian dystopia. A state not only merely exploits resources from a particular territory, but also misappropriates its power in order to maximize its benefit. So it turns out to be a modified form of Reaganomics over here, right? What happens is that as soon as people or these politicians who accumulate together to form one particular union, they start misappropriating their power, they start making policy decisions which necessarily benefit them and not necessarily the entire social welfare, right? So this idea of a bottom to top accumulation of politicians coming forward and then making this choice of they wanted to maximize their profits, and then going from a top to bottom trickle down effect of them reaping from these particular benefits necessarily makes sure that the state stops being a utopian instrument, rather starts being a dystopian instrument. So this accumulation of politicians leads to a situation which is called a situation of kleptocracy. The situation of kleptocracy was also seen in the former president of Indonesia, Mr. Suharto, who got $20 billion out of the entire economy just by owning banks and misusing those banks.
Hi, my name is Sateja, and today I'm going to be speaking against the motion. This House believes that governments having ownership in banks is a recipe for corruption and favoritism. I'm a student at BITS, Hyderabad. Nightclubs? Nah. Starbucks? Not really. Restaurants? The new place for hanging out in cities is now ATMs. The answer to the question, where can I meet new people, is that huge line in front of the bank. I too spent a lot of time in that line, and it is then that I realized that there's so much diversity in that line around me. And it's then I realized that demonetization, a prime example of government ownership in banks, has positively impacted so many lives, which is why I'm strongly against the motion, because government ownership in banks has nothing to do with corruption and favoritism. And let me tell you why by telling you about 3 people who stood in that line, right? So the first person is Ramu. Ramu is your local vegetable vendor. Ramu is standing there to get his 500s and thousands exchanged. A business like Ramu's is greatly impacted by changes in prices in the economy and by things like inflation. Now let me present an alternative scenario to you where only privately owned banks exist. Now you have a lot of power concentrated with a very few people. Like in UK, as we can see right now, 80% of the cash is in 5 banks, and there are 70 to 80 board members who are controlling this cash. Now these people have the liberty to do whatever they please with this cash because they are under no legal obligation to use it for the welfare of society. However, government-owned banks are accountable, private-owned banks are not accountable. And it's for this reason that slight changes in the prices as per the will of these privately owned banks can cause Ramu's business to go under. Coming to the next person in the line, Krishna. Krishna is a local entrepreneur. He has his own medical store called Krishna Medical Store. Now, local entrepreneurs received a huge impetus when there was a movement in Bangladesh by the Grameen Bank called microcredit. So the reason why this is so important is because microcredit is when you extend a small loan to somebody who may not really be able to pay you back, somebody who comes from a financially unstable background, right? And the reason why this is so important is because it's a huge risk to take up front. However, we have noticed that a huge number of businesses have also arisen because of this, leading to empowerment in the lower stratas of society, something private banks would never do, right? They would steer clear from something like this because there's no profit in empowering weaker stratas of society. Let's talk about what private banks have done for our economy. I'm sure you guys remember the 2008 financial recession. Yeah, that's what they have done for our economy. In US, because of selfish, risk-driven, and profit-driven decisions by a private bank called Lehman Brothers, it caused the entire collapse of the US economy, which led to huge repercussions throughout the world. That's what privately owned banks are going to do for you. And the third person I'd like to talk about is me. By me, I mean all of us, the youth, the citizens of India, the people who actually have the power to make a difference. Sure, government-owned banks do exist, but we elect the government, right? The Constitution provides us an amendment called the Right to Information Act, and it is because of this that we can hold those people accountable. If we feel that something is going against the norm, if we feel like there is corruption or favoritism prevalent, there always are measures in place by which we can correct what is wrong. So today I spoke to you about how government-owned banks are beneficial to our society, how they're beneficial to all stratas of society, and how privately owned banks are not. And that brings me to my final point about how corruption and favoritism are not adjectives of an individual. They're adjectives of certain people present in our society and cannot be used to talk about the government as a whole. So when we come out and we say that the government today is corrupt and it practices favoritism, that's wrong on our part, because that means that we're not doing our job. That means that we as citizens are not effectively engaging with our constitution amendments and not effectively engaging with the opportunities and privileges that the banking sector provides us. So I do urge you to strongly look into this and strive to make our economy better rather than playing the blame game. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Anirudh Badri. I'm from Shiv Nadar University, and today I'm going to speak against the motion, this House believes that governments having ownership in banks is a recipe for corruption and favoritism. So my argument today is going to consist of 2 major parts, right? The first is that while nationalization or government ownership of banks does create opportunities for corruption, it does not cause it. What do I mean by this? And how do I seek to explain away the seemingly endless line of nationalized banks that are mired in corruption, right? So what I mean to say is that corruption is caused by a failure in the rule of law. When government officials or in general officials believe that they can get away with crimes of corruption, then if there is no aim, if there is no objective or attempt to punish them, then corruption will flourish, with or without nationalization, or with or without government ownership of banks. How is that so? Because governments hold and wield tremendous amounts of power. Even if banks are not nationalized, even if governments do not have any ownership of banks as a whole, they still have the ability to shortchange vendors. They have the ability to carry out scams like 2G spectrum scams, all of which are acts of corruption, which means that it is the failure of rule of law that causes corruption to flourish, not the existence or absence of nationalization. So which brings us to the question of considering that the rule of law has failed, right? In that situation, is it better or worse? In that situation, is nationalization of banks a worse thing? Does that lead to greater corruption? That's the question that I seek to answer next. And there, my argument is going to show that in situations where the rule of law fails and corruption already exists, then private banks are going to be worse than public ones. So to argue that, we first need to agree on the fact that the objective of these private private banks is profit, right? So, and where does this profit for these banks come from? It doesn't come from the small vendors who are going to deposit tiny amounts in these banks. It's going to come from these huge billionaires and millionaires who are going to deposit huge amounts of money, huge amounts of assets in these banks, right? And therefore, what is the objective of these? Considering the objective of these banks, what is their business motto? They're going to be pandering towards the will of these billionaires, to the wills of these millionaires. And because if they don't do so, then another private bank is going to do that, because their objective is to make as much profit as possible. And since these banks need the patronage of these billionaires, they're going to give them concessions, which is the very definition of favoritism. Concessions that they would not otherwise give to normal people, right? They're going to be willing to write off the loans of maybe one billionaire, and because it means that so many other billionaires are going to come and invest with them, right? They're going to give huge loans, all of these to people who don't really need it, and as a result, this favoritism is actually going to damage the economy as a whole. More or less, consider that since these people are the major stakeholders of these banks, they're going to be willing to do unethical things in order to satisfy them, in order to ensure that these people don't jump ship and go to another bank that's willing to offer services like tax evasion, etc., right? Which is why we believe that this sort of, if rule of law has already failed, if corruption is already rampant, even then it is the public banks that have a better record than private ones. Why is it better? The answer to that lies in the fact that while public banks have more power, they are also more held accountable to the people, right? The government is held accountable to the people, which is something that is simply not true for private banks. As a result of all these things, ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arshia Amin Chaudhary, representing Jamia Millia Islamia, and today I'd like to speak against the motion. Now, before I'd like to begin with my arguments, let me tell you why exactly I choose to oppose today's motion, right? Why I choose to oppose today's motion is that when today's motion tells you that its first half is a recipe for the other half, what it's fundamentally trying to tell you is that governments having ownerships of banks is basically characterized by the concept of corruption and favoritism, something that is utterly and fundamentally wrong. Instead, government banks are characterized by the concept of trust, of faith, of credibility, and of the trust that the public has over these banks, right? Now, my first argument is that when you talk about the concept of corruption and favoritism, you have to understand that these traits are very individualistic in nature. So the government or your state cannot teach you to be corrupt or to be biased fundamentally. Now, when statistics tell you that a private bank employee earns a wage which is 1.5 times lesser than that of a public bank employee, you have to understand that this private bank employee, having lesser perks that include obviously pension and medical cost protection and all of that, has more incentive to indulge in corruption than a public bank employee does. Now, when you talk of favoritism, why is it that Rahul Gandhi is today the face of Congress after his grandmother and father? Why is it that today we have CEOs of company being sons of fathers who were then CEOs? Because favoritism exists in all spheres of life, not simply pertaining to public spheres. The point, ladies and gentlemen, is that you also have to talk about how there's a difference in intent between the public banks and the private banks. While your public banks will work towards public welfare, your private banks will only work towards profit maximization, right? So today, when you travel to 80% of your country, which is basically the rural side of your country, you will not find fancy names like HDFC or ICICI or Axis. What you will find instead, ladies and gentlemen, is the humble SBI welcoming you home. When you travel to the Naxalite villages of Chhattisgarh, when you travel to the remote corners of Jammu and Kashmir, of Leh and Ladakh, you will not find fancy private banks. What you will find, ladies and gentlemen, is SBI, is Bank of India, and other state-funded banks. My third constructive, ladies and gentlemen, talks about how even in countries which are not India, even in countries which are economically backward, you need to have the government to step in to form a fundamental banking system so that someday in the future, the country elevates itself into a position where private banking can come in, right? So for example, if you take the case of Russia in 1890s, Russia was facing a severe economic crisis. Their then finance minister, Mr. White, came in and said, let's take capital from France, let's open a Russo-Chinese bank, and then let's form a government-owned bank which will then facilitate banking and economy in our country. It is because of this man's vision, ladies and gentlemen, that in 2 years' time, Russia saw the biggest economic turnover that any country has ever seen, which is why Russia today is the gigantic power that it is. My fourth and final constructive, ladies and gentlemen, is that a man called Lenin, who was a visionary revolutionary in Russia, and he said once, and I quote, "Big banks are the very reason why socialism is possible." And he's right. Why did the world in 1960s and 70s see this sudden upsurge of nationalization of banks? Because governments and leaders throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia understood the concept that nationalization is what will make banking approachable to all of your majority and minority. That it is because of banking that you achieve three objectives, something that private banking cannot achieve, right? So you make banking accessible to all rural areas of your country, which is why today the rural youth and the rural majority understand concepts like credit, like loaning, like interest rates. It is because of public banking. Today, why is it that banking is accessible to the public? Because of government banks.
Good afternoon. I'm Zoe Bedi from Ashoka University. The motion I'm going to be addressing is, this House believes that government ownership in banks is a recipe for corruption and favoritism. I'm speaking for the motion. So what is the purpose of government intervention? It's twofold. It's the welfare of the common people and the stability of the economic system. Now I will present to you three arguments suggesting the exact opposite of that. In my opinion, government ownership of banks does three things. A, it distorts the free market. B, it provides an avenue for adverse selection. And C, it hardly achieves what it seeks to achieve. So speaking first of distortion of the free market, right? Governments are big organizations which are accountable to no one outside themselves. The recent example of demonetization exemplifies how governments are willing to take unpopular decisions, right? Now, as opposed to corporations which are accountable to A, their investors, B, their board of directors, and C, their shareholders. So what I'm trying to talk about is a monopoly over the banking system which reduces the incentive to maximize their performance due to a lack of accountability. My second point is there being an avenue for adverse selection, right? So think of the recent example of the SBI loan to Adani and Ambani just because of the mere virtue of them being Modi supporters, right? So my point here is that these banks will provide risky loans, which is cronyism, to these people in return of political favor. So their whole point about stability of economics falls flat when you are providing risky loans. Now the only difference is you are now going to provide risky loans to the elites instead of the common people, right? This brings me to the third point about how they hardly achieve what they seek to achieve, right? A recent report, December 2010 by the Economics Times, suggests that government intervention actually leads to a reduction in financial development and leads to a subsequent lower financial per capita income growth, right? So at this point, you need to question the reason for government intervention. If they're not achieving what they want, which is A, the welfare, and B, the stability of the economic systems, what really are they achieving? At this point, I'll refute two main arguments which have come from my opponents in favor of government intervention, right? The first one being, it will reduce risky behavior like that which led to the 2008 crisis, right? Now, this is a misdirection and a red herring, and it's an argument for regulation and not for ownership of banks. I am completely fine with
regulation, for example, a Chinese firewall being placed between commercial and investment banking, right? The US Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 disallows commercial banks from engaging in the investment business. This is providing the stability that the government banks or the government-owned banks seek to achieve but are not able to achieve. The second justification given is to integrate poor people into the system and promote the welfare of the citizens. This again is a logical justification for subsidies and not for government ownership, right? I'm completely fine with the Jan Dhan Yojana and such schemes being facilitated through the private banks whose goal end of the day is maximizing efficiency, right? So I've shown you how private banks can actually achieve what the government banks seek to achieve in a much better way, right? So what government intervention actually does is absolutely nothing. It is not achieving the goals it seeks to achieve. It is offering an avenue for corruption and favoritism, and it is definitely not being as accountable and as efficient as the private banks, right? So that brings me to my final point. Why private banks, and how do we escape from the risk of it becoming this elite capture and this capitalist system wherein only the rich are being forwarded, right? Again, as I mentioned, regulation is the answer, right? So my case statement finally then becomes regulation over ownership. And why regulation will be more effective is that it is an efficiency maximizing means of progressing with government regulation. So all the points being put in here in favor of government banks, how they'll look out for the welfare and how they'll keep a check on the commercial system are justified in the model of regulation. All we are doing is reducing the scope of corruption and favoritism in return for political favor. Your Adanis and your Ambanis will not be able to manipulate the government to their beck and will in the future. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Abhishek Kandasu. I'm from IIT Bombay. I'll be speaking against the motion. Einstein said that right-wing nationalism is an infantile disease. He called it the measles of mankind. Well, it's a good thing then that measles is curable, and he didn't call it the cancer, because then I would have had to look for another opening line. Right-wing nationalism, as we witness it today, is a regrettable narrative, because it means that mankind and humanity as a whole lose out. Fortunate for us then that it is something that is transient, something that I'm going to prove to you in my speech today. But before that, a few quick clarifications, right? Panel, Trump was not elected on the mandate of nationalism. Instead, he was elected on the mandate of xenophobic sentiments and an anti-establishment sentiment that is prevalent in America today, both of which are extremely distinct from nationalism, where nationalism is the idea where you prioritize individuals from your own country. He has said nationalistic things. He said that we must make America great again. He's talked about punitive action against China. He's talked about taxing companies that export jobs. Then again, panel, what we need to recognize is that these are not very different from existing sentiments within the US, something that is clearly visible through these two things, like the idea that the US already imposes a 500% tax on Chinese steel that is imported to the US, or the idea that the US provides tax breaks for domestic manufacturing, both of which indicate that there are more compelling narratives from other than nationalism, because nationalistically, Trump is very similar to existing US sentiments. The more compelling narratives being the economic anxieties that people have and the frustrations that people have with the political elite, a cabal that is rigid and refuses to change. Which means that this radically different narrative is something that is different from what is conventionally mainstream, and that is the mandate on which he has gotten elected. Given this, let's look at the bigger picture, right? Let's look at whether nationalism ever trumps, forgive the pun, economic incentives in status quo. Citing the example of, say, Brexit. Panel, punctured in history are examples of short-term nationalism. Take the examples of, say, Ataturk in Turkey or Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. What we must recognize is that globalization, however, prevails in the longer term. The reason for this is that there are concrete benefits that globalization provides that nationalism just can't substitute for. What are these benefits, right? One, the idea that free trade in status quo is something that is mutually beneficial. That developing countries are able to get jobs and increased wages as a result of free trade. Developing countries lack capital that is needed in order to invest in industries, in order to provide for these benefits. this is clearly visible in the stark difference between pre- and post-liberalization India. The idea that India was able to move from a primarily agrarian economy to a service economy through liberalization is indicative of this. But moreover, even developed countries benefit from this. What we need to recognize is that markets in developed countries tend to get saturated, which is why firms now move to developing countries, because this investment in developing countries offers better growth for these firms. And through the growth of these firms, developed countries also benefit. But then the second benefit of globalization, right? Like that countries in themselves are not self-sustaining. The fact remains that most countries are often reliant on other countries for raw materials for their industries or technology in order to optimize resource utilization. Removal of free trade and globalization means that this removes avenues of growth for these countries. This is particularly problematic because the alternative to this is very pernicious. The idea that then in order to obtain resources, you will resort to the ideas of war, something that is visible through the nationalistic sentiments of Mussolini and Hitler, something that led to widespread economic and human loss.
Hi, I'm Dhriti Malhotra from Mount Carmel College. The topic for today is, in light of Trump's victory, this House believes that nationalism will always upstage globalization and free trade even in the modern societies. And I am against the topic. I would like to start by quoting Kofi Annan. He said that arguing against globalization is like arguing against the laws of gravity. Now, I may be brave and courageous to stand here and speak in front of all of you, but I definitely do not want to argue against the laws of gravity. Now, let us analyze why Trump was victorious. What was the reason? Most of Trump's supporters, according to a lot of reports, were male, white, and poor. People with no college degree. With a large number of jobs being outsourced to China and India, the number of jobs for the blue-collar employees in USA itself suffered greatly. It was this fear and hatred that Trump tapped on and reaped the benefits of. He promised jobs to millions, and that is what led to his success. Trump has won, and that is a fact that we know. But what is the end goal here? Who won the elections, or what is best for the American economy? One instance cannot be held as proof that nationalism will always upstage globalization. Globalization and free trade have been in many instances considered to contribute greatly to economic development. One great example is the Asian tigers, the countries of Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea, which are role models for the rest of the world, and they have empowered their economy solely through trade. Past 1945 in Japan, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, there was a state of complete devastation. There were no natural resources, and they imported raw materials and exported their finished goods. This is what led to their rapid growth. In China, there was widespread poverty, unemployment, overpopulation. It was isolated from the rest of the world. But then, in the 1970s and 1980s, they brought in economic reforms. Their economic ideology shifted to a market economy, while their political ideology continued to be communism. They encouraged foreign investment, and the East Coast was a special economic zone. There was cheap labor and no taxes and regulations. This is what encouraged a lot of the American and European firms to come and set up their industries in China. Nationalism and globalization need not be mutually exclusive. Sometimes nationalism is supporting globalization and free trade, as that is what is best for your economy and country at that point of time. Trade helps to increase specialization of production and in labor. It provides better quality goods at cheaper prices. It provides the consumers with larger choices and also acts as a vent for surplus. While self-sufficiency is extremely important, trade cannot be avoided, especially in today's economy, which is geographically vast, and certain countries lack resources or the skills to produce a particular commodity. Every country is interdependent in some way or another. Psychologically speaking, it is human nature to think of yourself before others. This is exactly what a majority of the Trump voters did. They thought of more job opportunities not just for themselves, but also for their children. Their reason to vote for Trump was self-preservation, and not because they believed in nationalism, and they voted for him because they didn't think about the overall impact that Trump's certain extreme policies would have on the economy. Thank you.
A very good morning, members of the House. The motion out here states, in light of Trump's victory, this House believes that nationalism will always upstage globalization and free trade even in modern societies. This is Masoom Sachdev from the Indian Institute of Management, Indore, and I stand here to firmly support the motion. Now, before you get me wrong, I'm not a mercantilist, I'm not a right-wing patriot, I'm in fact a John Lennon fan. And out here, I stand to propose that so long as the world is being viewed, the world is being imagined as being composed of nation states, that is the world as a sum of nationalities, we will never get to globalization in the first place. The context out here is the victory of Donald Trump in an election which was largely revolving around the issue of national identity. So let me define what national identity and nationalism are in the first place. Nationalism is when the individual is able to feel that the national interests are being reciprocated and vice versa. And globalization is simply, loosely defined, things getting across boundaries easily. I mean, things, people, ideas being able to cross boundaries. Now, the understanding of nation-state in the modern world, in contemporary times, is largely based on the logic of the Enlightenment era. We go back to 1400s. You see, nation-states arose at the same time when the Renaissance movement was seeing its peak. In that sense, nation-states operate through institutions and are largely based on grand narratives. You see? Grand narratives of being the biggest provider, grand narratives of being patriarchs. And in that sense, while the nationalists argue that the objective of the nation state is to provide welfare, I argue that the objective of the nation state is only self-preservation. Self-preservation externally by drawing up boundaries and setting up defenses. Self-preservation internally on the account of legitimacy. Legitimacy gained through welfare. Legitimacy gained on the account of permeation of a culture which might be historically based, because a nation is socio-political and cultural. So culture which may be historically based and culture which will be permeated in the future. Trump won because 47% of the people resonated with his ethnic rhetoric, not jobs, not economics, but an ethnic rhetoric. Back in 2008, Barack Obama won because over 50% of the people resonated with his rhetoric of large banks needed to be put aside and blacks and other Hispanics and other minorities needed to be brought about to the fore. The issue out here is of legitimacy. Nation states always produce actors and discourses which are based on the concept of legitimacy of the masses in that sense. And while grand narratives tend to permeate across time, grand narratives also tend to marginalize narratives of the minorities. Grand narratives also tend to promote culture and permeate culture and preserve culture which stands in the face of globalization. Because while people may say that the world is getting global, borders are being crossed, the world is flat, I would like to argue that we never globalized in the first place. Here are a few statistics, ladies and gentlemen. 15% of the world's total economic output, only 15%, is able to cross borders. 26% of the world's average GDP is composed of exports, that is 26% out of 100%. 42% is the increase in likelihood for me and you to trade if we speak a common language. That increases to 200% when me and you use the same currency. And speaking of trade, whoever told you that trade is free was a liar, because the biggest problem of the United States has been also the biggest embargo imposer. Again, one thing that comes off the top of my head is when USA placed embargoes on Indian wheat, when on the account of Indian wheat being unhygienic, containing pests, while in fact it is reciprocating the interests of the agricultural lobby, which has a very strong foe, because again, it's a nation state, it needs to represent the interests of the nation, tends to promote a culture, and that culture would always come as a hindrance when we're talking of globalization. Fact of the matter is that I do not say that the House should believe that nationalism should upstage globalization. Nationalism would always upstage globalization, because that is how things are. Because when people talk, national identities talk. And since these national identities are based on self-preservation, they are hawkish in that sense, and so long as the world is imagined as being composed of nation states, we can never be free and we can never globalize. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Anil Faridi, and I'm from Aligarh Muslim University. Now I'll be speaking against the motion with the kind permission of the Honorable Chairpersons that in light of Trump's victory, this House believes that nationalism will always upstage globalization and free trade even in the modern societies. Honorable Chairperson, this is 2016. It's not 1989 when the Berlin Walls came down. It is not the time when globalization was a mantra of society. Honorable Chairperson, this is a time after Brexit, after Donald Trump's candidacy revolved around the idea of nationalism. Or is it so? I like to quote 4 arguments to cite my case. My first argument, Honorable Chairperson, is that Trump won because he appeased a section of the American society. Now we know what Trump did. His raucous comments against women, hilarious impersonations against disabled Hispanics, African Americans, and Muslims. Add to this the fact that the American society suffers from homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Islam. The cumulative effect, Honorable Chairperson, was that packaged under ideas of Americans coming in the forefront, he was basically playing on the resentments of a section of American society. Now, we have to ask to us, Honorable Chairperson, that is this the sense of American nationalism that we are talking about? Is American identity rooted in the fact that there are stereotypes, there is bigotry, or is it rooted in the fact there are common ideals to strive for, irrespective of race, religion, or ethnicity? Basically, Honorable Chairperson, do we believe that America is a land of opportunity or not? My first argument was that Trump appeased a crowd of voters who haven't reconciled two large social phenomena of our times: racial emancipation and ethnic diversity on one hand, and gender equality on the other. Moving on to my second argument, Honorable Chairperson, Trump promised jobs. We know that in the American society, there's a rising economic inequality. There's a stagnant middle class which is despaired with its income. This is because the aftermath of globalization. Now these voters, they're disgruntled with the economic crisis. They do not care about they're not fans of the debt-faced military commitments that America has taken place. What they want is jobs, and Trump promised that. Trump promised employment. Trump promised that he would double the GDP growth, Honorable Chairperson. And these voters, they were not swayed by the sense of nationalism. They just wanted to save the hide. In fact, there are many voters who have come out in the open who do not agree to the colored comments Donald Trump made in his presidential candidacy, but they agree that they want jobs. Moving on to my third argument, Honorable Chairperson, Donald Trump is against anti-globalization. What he said that he's going to renegotiate NAFTA, that's North American Free Trade Agreement, and he's going to import tariff 35% on Mexico and 45% on Chinese. Now, what does this mean? It means that there will be a potential trade war, Honorable Chairperson, against China and Mexico that will result in huge inflation, that will result in huge loss of jobs across the three countries. This will also result in the fact that the imports coming from Chinese and Mexico countries, they are basically intermediary for domestic products. This ensures that jobs in the domestic world in America, the competition increases, and hence the competition will decrease and there will be less amount of jobs. Also, when you decide that you're going to just be a nationalistic country and you will stop exports also, then there will be less amount of dollars in the US markets in foreign countries. This will ensure that the spending capacity for people outside US will decrease, and hence the US exports will not be that much appreciated. Moving on to my fourth argument, Honorable Chairperson, America is known for its globalization stand. We have seen that it has exerted hegemony in various places. We have seen, Honorable Chairperson, that its foreign policy reflects strongly that it wants to dictate American ideals all over the place.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Reem Kamar from Jamia Millia Islamia, and the motion before the House says that in the light of Trump's victory, nationalism will always upstage globalization and free trade even in modern societies, and I, for one, stand against the motion. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, is the heart of the heartless world. It's just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. Religion is the opium of the people, Karl Marx said in 1843. Now, religion, ladies and gentlemen, exactly like nationalism, is based on situations that we have no choice in. So if I'm expected to follow Islam just because I'm born in a particular family, then in exactly the same way, I'm expected to love my country that I was given birth in. Now, this religious sentiment has been in existence in this society since way before the concept of nationalism even came into the picture. And it's just now, after decades and decades of religion being at the forefront of everything, it's just now that the Daily Mail is able to post an update which says that having no religious affiliation is now the world's third largest faith after Christianity and Islam. So at the risk of hurting sentiments and emotions, I will maintain my objectivity and proclaim that religion is not far from being redundant in this modern society, and that nationalism will also take the same path soon enough. So when we talk about nationalism, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very loose concept and open to manipulation. At its best, nationalism talks about uniting the people of the country around some common value or goal or aspiration. Now, this civic sense of nationalism promotes universal values like equality and freedom. But then there's another sense of nationalism that Mr. Donald Trump promotes, which is this ethnic sense of nationalism. Now, this revolves around aggression and hurt and sentiments and emotions. And this ethnic nationalism actually hurts the society. So when Mr. Donald Trump stands and makes a vow to make America great again, he is actually echoing Ronald Reagan in the 1980. So Mr. Donald Trump won the US presidency because he also promised to bring about a historic once-in-a-lifetime change. But the difference remained that Ronald Reagan dreamt of a country which looked not only inwards but outwards towards others, and that he wanted America to make the world safe. So today when we talk about nationalism upstaging globalization and free trade in the light of Trump's victory, what I don't understand is that what kind of victory are we even talking about when today we have people outside the White House holding explicitly worded words against Donald Trump. And when one day after Donald Trump got elected as the president of the United States of America, there were protests being held in 30 cities across the United States of America. I don't understand if Donald Trump actually achieved something, because to me that victory was negated. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump did not win because of nationalism. He won because of an image projection. What Mr. Trump did was that he took all the problems, all the major problems according to him in his country, namely unemployment and terrorism and crimes like rape and murder, and he narrowed them all down to one single problem, that is migration. And then he gave you a beautifully crisp solution, that is expelling them all. So when Mr. Donald Trump tells you that he will build a 10-meter high wall to protect his economy, he fails to grasp two very important concepts. Number one is that when you build that 10-meter high wall, you are only giving the people the incentive to make an 11-meter high ladder. And number two, that China and North Korea have already been successful in making these walls, and that has not been and have failed miserably in achieving their end game. Because today China has opened its gate to globalization, but North Korea suffers through extreme political corruption and massive economic crisis.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Uttara, and I'm here to argue, relying not only on militant hope but also, hopefully, some appeal to reason, that in the light of Donald Trump's victory, or perhaps in the dark of it, nationalism will not always upstage globalization and free trade, even in modern societies. Now, before getting into the meat of my arguments, I'd like to briefly unpack the assumptions of this motion, in which there resides, according to me, an inherent tension. Certainly, there is cause of concern following Trump's spectacularly unpredictable victory on the back of explicitly nationalist rhetoric against globalization and free trade. However, for all the mathematical merits of extrapolation, this perhaps is not the best framework for human affairs. I mean, how can we take one tipping point event, which is the outcome of a vast number of forces unique to a particular moment in history, and use that to make a claim about what might always be the case in the hopefully many unfolding epochs of human history? Now, in order to address my challenges to these assumptions, I'm going to go back historically and ask the question, how did globalization emerge in the first place? The last time aggressive nationalism held sway was in the aftermath of the First World War. And what happened next? Only the most calamitous event the world had ever known, the Second World War. Now, without getting into the particular politics, which 4 minutes doesn't allow me to do, the fact is this: the logic of nationalism always relies on building an identity against another, racial or religious or whatever the case may be. But the fact is also that no nationalism is an island. So even as aggressive nationalist identity may claim to seek immunity from outsiders, they cannot deny or alter the fact of their existence, leading to a world order in which multiple aggressive nationalisms stand in hostility to one another. Now, it is not too much of a logical stretch to say that this is a very tense situation at best, and at worst, a world war. So this motion not only makes a huge unfounded temporal leap about what the case will always be, but also a cultural and geographical one. Look no further than home. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has clearly demonstrated that globalization and nationalism do not necessarily have to stand in contention to one another. Even as, on the one hand, he draws political currency from often radical ethnic nationalist Hindu groups, in the same breath, he invites modernizing reform and foreign investment. Even as Donald Trump has threatened to cancel the Trans Pacific trade deal, China has begun its own regional trade partnership, thereby strengthening its role as a leader in global trade. Now, the fact is this: even as Donald Trump turns America inward unto itself, those of us who at this moment have the extreme privilege of standing outside this implosion must not fall sway to the self-fulfilling American myth. America is not the mirror to which the rest of the world needs to be held up. There is no reason for those of us sitting in regions outside the America, outside the West, to necessarily partake in the American narrative. I'm not standing here denying that globalization has fulfilled all its promises. Indeed, even as living conditions have improved between countries, there have been widespread inequalities within them, leading to working class families feeling dispossessed of their own country at the hand of what they see as rapacious, hateful immigrants. However, the fact is this: as history has shown us, multiple nationalisms is an inherently unsustainable world order which will always yield in favor of a global alternative. What that alternative might be, I don't stand here claim to knowing. But if history has shown us anything, it is this: never say always. Thank you.
My name is Sahil Bhargava and I'm from Ashoka University. The motion before this house is that this house believes that government should have no regulatory control over news media, and I will be speaking for the motion. So what is the purpose of a democracy? What is it in a democracy that you do not find in other forms of government? A democracy promises its citizens certain civil liberties that you don't find elsewhere. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom of expression, and most importantly, accountability of a government. What does accountability of a government mean? In a democratic setup, citizens exercise their right to vote and they elect a government into power. When they elect a government into power, the government has an obligation to fulfill the needs of the citizens. And when they fail to do so, you question the government, you ask them questions, you ask them, why are you not doing your job? This entire mechanism is the mechanism of accountability. Now, the idea is that in any country, in a democracy in particular, accountability is there, but how does accountability utilize itself? How is accountability actually practiced in a country? That is where the role of media becomes important, because mark my words, media is that active instrument of checks and balances that asks the government questions, that presents to you a forum, a platform to present a spectrum of perspectives and allows you to question the government on matters of policy and decision making. The problem is that if you have government regulating the media, you cannot really have this questioning, because if the government controls it, the media is not independent anymore. I will illustrate this through a couple of examples. Example number one, the idea of demonetization. Immediately when Narendra Modi announced that 500 rupee notes will not be legal tenders, the move was praised, the move was hailed, that it's a fight against black money. However, a couple of days afterwards, we were hearing stories that ATM banks are not calibrated, ATMs are running out of cash, there are long queues in the banks, and the primary people and the people who were bearing the brunt of all of this were the poor people who are daily wage laborers, whose 2 square meals a day depends on them showing up to work, but instead they were showing up to banks and coming back empty-handed. The idea is that this mismanagement chaos, you would not have heard about this had you not had an independent media to begin with. If you had a media that was running on the instructions of the government, you would only hear the idea that this is good for the country, where we can clearly see other perspective that this is not the case. The second idea is the idea of Brexit. Brexit happened, Britain withdrew from the European Union. We clearly know that the government in Britain did not support the idea of Brexit. They said that Britain should be a part of the EU. But at the same time, you had people who wanted to leave the EU for whatever reasons there were. I'm not saying it is right or wrong, but the idea that government did not have control over the media, these people were allowed to air their views, these people were allowed to run their propaganda, their objective, their lobbying or whatever they did. People would could listen to a different perspective, a different narrative, a different version, a different story, and then come to an informed decision that this is what is good for us and make an informed choice. When you have government control, the problem is that people are less informed. Why? Because there is an information withdrawal from the system. When there is an information withdrawal, what happens is that there is no discourse, there is no debate, there is no discussion. Whatever the government tells you, or whatever whoever is regulating it, whatever they tell you is right, and there are no two ways about it. What that leads to is a less informed public, as a consequence of which society does not progress. Why does society not progress? Because in a democracy, or for the growth of human beings, you need debate, you need discussion, you need to analyze different ideologies and then come to a conclusion that this is how I want to make my independent decision, and this is the decision I will make. Debate and discourse take society forward. And when you have this, when you have government regulating this, debate cannot happen, discourse cannot happen, and therefore society stagnates, which is against the idea of a democracy. You descend into dictatorship and authoritarianism, which is completely not what a democracy stands for. Therefore, having government control is the first step towards authoritarianism, and therefore government should not have control over news media. Thank you very much.
I'm Ekta C. Shetty from the Indian Institute of Management, Lucknow. India ranked an abysmal 140th on the Press Freedom Index by a survey released in 2016. But wait, China ranked 176th, and the US did not do too well, 44th. The three most influential countries in the world do not actually do much for the rights of journalists and the media. Let me talk about an incident that happened very recently in India. Now, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry decided to impose a one-day ban on NDTV India, the Hindi wing of NDTV, because they believed that strategically sensitive information was revealed during the Pathankot attacks that happened in January 2016. Now, NDTV, in its defense, said that the same information was quoted by all newspapers and print houses as well. And to be honest, as a citizen of this country, as a viewer, I do not exactly remember what was the sensitive information that was released 10 months back. Now, the government does not exactly explain or does not draw a line as to what it defines as impeding the national security of the country. It just decides to ban websites or newspapers as and when it feels. Now, because the government did this, I'm sure a few days later, every chief minister and every state government would also want to do the same thing. Now, on March 8th, 2015, NDTV went blank for an hour because the India's Daughter documentary was not allowed to be shown. Now, NDTV believed that in a very civilized and dignified way, it could protest against a very silly act of the government. Now, the government does not realize that visuals and broadcasts that incite racial and communal violence have been there right from the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, the freedom of speech and expression is one of our fundamental rights. The freedom of press is not implicitly given anywhere, but the Supreme Court, in the case of the Indian Express versus the Union of India, clearly specified that the press does have the right to do three things: to circulate information, to publish, and to have access to all sources of information. Of course, the media should use it judiciously, but it does have the right to publish all kinds of information. Now, there was a ban on FTV and AXN for publishing obscene and vulgar content in 2010 and 11. As individuals, we're all mature enough to know what is right for us and what is wrong for us. Nobody is forcing it upon us. If we want to view it, we will. If not, then it's again our choice. The government has no right to impose a ban on any channel as such. Now, if not for the media, the Anna Hazare agitation would not have been so successful. Just imagine the Narendra Modi government came to power solely on the basis of the publicity done in the media, especially the digital media. So it owes it all to the media. Now, post that, we also know that many corrupt ministers and the coal 4G scam, all that was revealed because of the vigilant work of the media. So I firmly believe that the media should be kept under the purview of, should not be kept under the purview of the government, But very recently, the former Press Council of India President Markande Karchu had proposed that the media can be brought under the purview of the Press Council of India, which by itself is a self-regulatory and independent body. So I would also propose the same. There should be regulations so that the media uses its freedom judiciously, but as such, the freedom should not be curbed.
My name is Shyam Agarwal. I am from Jindal Global Law School. I'll be speaking for the motion. This House believes that a government should have no regulatory control over news media. Now, let me make it very clear to this House what I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to be arguing that there should be no regulatory control whatsoever. After all, journalists often do act irresponsibly. Examples of this are the publications of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, which published extremely Islamophobic and obscene cartoons, leading to the terrorist attacks thereafter. And Barkha Dutt's coverage of the Kargil war in 1999, which compromised the positions of Indian troops. So I'm not arguing that there should be no regulatory control whatsoever. I'm simply saying that this regulatory control should not be at the behest of the government. Why do I say this? Because the press, as the fourth estate in this democracy, is the most trenchant critic of the government of the day. And therefore, any government has a vested interest to muzzle the press, to muzzle the criticism by the press against the government. This is a similar argument that was propounded by the judges of the Supreme Court in the judgment in which they struck down the NJAC, because they said that the biggest litigator in Indian courts is the government, and if you have the government appointing judges, then obviously it's going to lead to sympathetic judgments in favor of the government. So if we want a fully functioning press, we cannot afford to let this conflict of interest continue. Now, what is the present state of affairs? The present state of affairs is that under the Cable Television Networks Act, the government can prohibit not only transmission of certain programs, but can order a wholesale prohibition of the operation of a cable television network. Now, the order against NDTV, which the previous speaker spoke about, was issued under this very provision. Now, I'm not going into the merits of that order because that is sub judice. But what I'm arguing is that the government under this statute can go ahead and ban any program or any network channel. Now, therefore, what is the solution? The solution is that we need to have an independent body composed of judicial members and working journalists and members of civil society who decide what should be shown and what should not be shown on a television news channel. The Press Council of India is ideally this body. However, it is toothless. According to the statute of the Press Council, it can only reprimand it can only issue advisory opinions to the government on how to promote freedom of press. It doesn't have any penalizing powers, which still vest with the government. And the Press Council of India today is merely a ruse that the government has given to give the impression that actually there is this independent body that is monitoring you, whereas the penal powers, the real powers, still vest with the government. I would like to cite a model that this independent body can be based on, and this model is the Central Board for Film Certification, which is the CBFC, which is responsible for issuing certificates to films. This body is again composed of independent experts on film. It is composed of judicial members, and it is responsible for pre-censorship of films. There is in fact an appellate tribunal. If you are dissatisfied with the order of the CBFC, then you can appeal to the Film Censorship Appellate Tribunal and get relief. In fact, in a recent judgment of the Supreme Court, Section 6 of this statute was struck down because it said that the central government can interfere with the orders of the CBFC. So, if we can have a body like the CBFC for films, why can't we have a similar independent body for the press? With that, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
My name is Anmol Mittal. I'm from National Law University, Delhi, and I will be speaking against the motion. I get that when I'm walking into a room written, I pay for free news, there is a disposition against any governmental regulatory control. But I do not have arguments to offer to you. I simply have a concept to explain. My idea is that independence of media must in itself be independent. When you go ahead, like my previous speakers, and say that independence of media can only be measured when it is independent from government, what you are doing is you are setting a standard for what the independence of the media can be. And here is my problem with it. I have three clarifications to make, post which I shall rest my case. First, we must understand this is not a debate simply about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is an individual's right, whereas in news media corporations, as we see these days, NDTV, Z News, etc., are all money-making establishments. Therefore, to extend to them the same leniencies as we do to an individual's freedom of speech will not be fair. Therefore, we must understand that this debate is about the freedom of news media, not simply the freedom of speech of an individual. Secondly, however you may go ahead and think of these news media houses, their central purpose is to facilitate choice. What do I mean by that? What I consider to be the correct political, social opinion or cultural choice is something that the media facilitates. Whether the choice that I finally end with is correct or not isn't their burden, but their burden is to give me reliable options to go ahead and reach that choice. Whether simply their burden is to help me navigate through the absurdities of life. Whether I like to spend my time reading a poem about pizza or going out to see a sunshine march about Harambe is something that I will finally choose, but their task is to give me reliable information with that. The biggest burden on them is that they have the power of retrospect. They get to see things after they happen and write them down, talk about them in a manner which goes into the historical record. Therefore, here is my derivation from that. There is responsibility and there is the need for a standard on the media. Secondly, this idea of regulation on instantly transforming into control, I do not think that is true. I think that the same way there is over-regulation in India, there is under-regulation, and under-regulation in itself is a problem. Why do I say that? Two reasons. Firstly, let's understand there is reason why we still do not allow foreign countries to go ahead and fund Indian lawyers the same way we do not allow them to fund Indian media houses. Why? Because we think that these are all propaganda machines. And if you go ahead and you devolve all power and all standard away from these propaganda machines into external factors, it leads to major problems. Why do we think those major problems are still serious? We tell you that those problems are still serious because in a world where the government and the news media, the two biggest ways of creating propaganda in the current society, go ahead and are at loggerheads, where the government has no control over the media, the government has no incentive for the media to grow, because at all points in time the government will see the media as an antagonizing force. Why do we think that government seeing the media as an antagonizing force is a problem? Case in point, Pakistan, where journalists are shot by ISI orders, where people at no point in time being in the media industry feel safe from the government, which is why we think there is some place for the two of them to meet, consult, so that at least people on both sides feel safe about the existence of each other. Whether someone has power over the other is a separate question. And lastly, when the media has to be regulated, when there is a need for regulation because there is need for a standard, who does it? We tell you that if you remove the government out of place, the corporates do it. When the corporates do it, what happens? Viewer discretion and assimilating power for the viewers and a huge number of viewers is your first and primary goal. In that situation, there is no discourse. You will only have an alt-right and alt-left existing at the two corners, a Breitbart and an NYT, for example, and nothing in between. There will no be spacing out so as to go ahead and increase what all is talked about, to go ahead and give more opinions, and media will falter in its fundamental duty of providing choice or facilitating choice. Lastly, when you talk about government being present, and the problem is that, well, there will be over-regulation. Here is a question of investment of faith. What we are investing in when we assume that the government will necessarily go ahead and over-regulate is an investment in fear and not an investment in hope.
A very good afternoon to one and all. Hi, I'm Parul and I'm from Shivnada University, and I'll be speaking for the motion this House believes that there should be no regulatory control over news media. Before I commence, I want to ask people sitting out here, how many of you have seen Enemy of State? Yes, that brings very fond memories of Will Smith and Gene Hackman, but it also brings the naked truth of what government is capable of doing behind the scenes. It brings into the picture, the gory picture of what government is capable of doing with a common person who has no influence to the public. Well, that being said, today, my friend, government has become a big, magnanimous animal, which is scared of no one but to control its reputation in the media. And when they cannot beat the media, they're trying to control it and thereby swallow it. Media, my friend, is the biggest influencer in the society. It shapes me, you, our attitude, our perception, everything. So something as crucial and as pivotal as media, how can you put any kind of control over it? The very constitution of this democratic nation tells us that media gives us the liberating platform to come up with our own ideas. The very liberating idea of freedom of speech, freedom to information, everything is a question if you put a control over them. How can a third party dictate what we and what you can say and cannot say? Well, the biggest example, my friend, is China. This power play has played there. And what does it has brought us? Country in which their own citizen doesn't know what is going on, what is the reality, because media today has controlled everything. It has just become a puppet in the hands of government. Rather, being a tool to supervise the government, it is just a tool in the hands of government. Controlling media is no less than handcuffing me, you, and our generations, of getting our emotions, our cognition, to judge what is right and wrong. We don't need a babysitter now to tell us this is right, this is what has to be done, and this is what is being done. So, my friend, I would state that there should be no government or no third party, for that matter, between a free media and a common consumer of media. Media is the most equalizing and liberating platform, and controlling it would be endangering innovation, open access to information, freedom to speech, and of course, everything that we stand for. Not only this, controlling media, which is allegedly the watchdog of the society, which is the voice to the voiceless, it will be taking the level playing field to them and bringing a monopolistic market in which consumer is the ultimate loser in long and short run. So where are you heading? What do you want to do with the controlling media? My worthy opinion here must have said some gory pictures about media today and sensitization of media. But I want to ask them a simple fact, that can they answer by regulating them, by putting government on top of them? Can they control that bribe, which I call as a legal transaction? You might call any fancy or sophisticated name to that business transaction. Well, I will call it as a bribe. A bribe is a bribe is a bribe. And media should be free from any sort of government control, for that matter. By that being said, I would like to conclude that controlling media would promote more information asymmetry. And with information asymmetry, no one can win in this country. Not you, not me, but yes, the government. So the ball is in your court. What do you want to have for your children and for yourself? Therefore, stop this control on media, because there is no control on freedom of speech. Thank you and have a very nice day ahead.
Good afternoon, I'm Yashna Mehta. I'm a student of National Law School, Bangalore, and unlike a lot of my friends, I will be speaking against the motion that this House believes that government should have no control over news media. 7th August 1999. I woke up to the news of my uncle having passed away in an underground military bunker in Kargil. From the age of 6, all I remember is my relatives crying unconsolably, and year after year, on the same date, going to a park that was named after him to light a candle. But what happened that day? Barkhadat went to a war zone to get an exclusive scoop for her channel with a satellite phone. A phone that not even army generals were allowed to have. A phone that allowed Pakistanis to track the location of the army base camp and bomb the same. Yes, we understand the importance of an impartial and independent media. We understand the importance of freedom of speech and expression. And while we do not advocate for absolute governmental control over news media, we believe that some control is in fact critical. In furtherance of the same, I will be speaking to you about 4 things. Firstly, regarding the nature of news media today. Secondly, regarding the legitimacy of these restrictions. Thirdly, regarding the grounds on which these restrictions can be placed. And fourthly, why they must be placed on news media as compared to any other form of media. News media refers to those constituents of mass media that primarily focus on delivering information or news to the general public. Regulatory control in this regard allows the government to exercise control or restriction to curtail the kind of information that these news media agencies can in fact disseminate. While normatively, news media agencies seek to act as a merely information disseminating mechanism, well, realistically, given that they are also a business, they are governed by the law of demand. So when the law of demand and supply tells them that I want to know about the stars of Sasural Simarka, why will they tell you about Syria? Why will they tell you about Kashmir? Why will they tell you about the Paralympic Games? And where has this invisible hand of the market led news media to? Thousands of instances of paid news, cross-sensitization, media trials, dissemination of confidential information, right? And we tell you that on one hand, whereas paid news and sensitization attack the very root of news agencies themselves and attack their very foundation in terms of disseminating information, on the other hand, given the sort of legitimacy they derive from the virtue of being a news channel, coupled with the entertainment value, things like media trial not only prejudice adjudication of matters in court, but also make the social lives of the people involved in these disputes extremely hard, even before they are in fact acquitted. So we then tell you what are the justifications for these restrictions, right? My friend spoke about the manner in which the Constitution talks about the freedom of speech and expression. However, if we look at national or international instruments that provide this right, the same articles also allow for restrictions on the same. Article 19.2 of the Constitution of India, 19.3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and 29.3 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights allow for several grounds on which such restrictions can be placed. And we believe that these restrictions should be placed on the media by the government. These restrictions include restrictions on hate speech, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, pornography, things that compromise national security and public order. We also tell you that these do not impede the accountability of the government, as the government orders are still subject to review by court. They also do not impede the impartiality or the independence of the media, as it can still report on every other thing, and if they find a government order to be onerous, they can approach the court for it. We also tell you that there is enough jurisprudence to define these terms and give guidance to their interpretation. We therefore say that it's time to be responsible. It's time to save lives. It's time to be aware, and it's time to pay to keep your news free. And we're very, very proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pallavi Mishra. I'm from National Law University, Delhi. I'm going to be talking about how environmental damage is inevitable while creating opportunities for poverty alleviation. Before moving on ahead with the motion, let me clarify the ambit of this debate, right? We need to necessarily analyze what this debate is specifically pointing at. We need to understand within this ambit of debate are falling the countries which are developing in nature. We need to understand that the definition of poverty for countries which are developed in nature and which are still developing is extremely different. So this motion definitely points at people who are poor in nature, and their poverty is defined by people who do not have the basic means of sustenance, people who are fighting their day-to-day life in order to carry on, in order to survive in this environment. And therefore, this notion definitely points at countries which are developing in nature. Therefore, when we talk about opportunities for pulling people out of poverty, or opportunities of creating opportunities of growth, or creating opportunities of employment, we need to necessarily look into it from the aspect of looking at a developing country. Now, when we talk about poverty alleviation, we need to, my speech is basically going to be in two aspects. First, what are the economic measures that are necessarily going to lead to poverty alleviation? And secondly, why these efforts might necessarily cause environmental damage. First, I'm going to talk about what economic measures are going to lead to poverty alleviation. Poverty alleviation requires the generation of employment at a large scale in an inclusive manner. What do we mean by inclusive manner? Inclusive includes the people who are at the lowest strata of the economic stratification of the society. Therefore, the people who do not have the basic means of sustenance, these people who are employed in engagements which are in the informal sector, which are of low productive nature. Therefore, these people who do not have the opportunities of getting employed in employments which are going to give them a scope or avenues of moving forward into the economic prosperous zone. These are the people that are going to be affected by these economic employment generation opportunities that must be created. Therefore, we necessarily need to analyze why we need industrialization, and this is where we come about to the second line of argumentation throughout the course of my debate. We need industrialization to propel these people from poverty-stricken backgrounds to the economic prosperous zones. Why is industrialization the best manner in which we can move forward towards inclusive growth, and why any other manner is not as effective as industrialization? I'm going to talk about this in two aspects. First,
how industrialization is an extremely labor-absorbent industry, and second, why these people who do not have any specialized skills can only be propelled and can only be benefited by industrialization. First, the fact that these industries that fall under the ambit of industrialization are extremely labor-absorbent in nature, and they have the ability to employ mass labor and have an expansive sector. Therefore, people who are unskilled in nature, who do not have any specialized technical skills, can easily be employed in this sector and can be shifted from the informal sector to the formal sector now, where they have lots of avenues of generation of employment, of generation of economic prosperity. Now we need to understand why informal sector is better, formal sector is better than informal sector, because of the high rates of productivity, better wages, and better employment opportunities in the future that these people get, the better vocational training and the on-the-job training that these people are going to get. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why environmental damage is necessarily going to happen. As I have characterized in the first part of my debate, the main ambit of this debate lies with developing nations. These developing nations do not have the economic capability of employing green technologies. They do not have the money to employ technologies which, even in the industrialization sector, which are going to be beneficial for climate change.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shivani Jha from Mount Carmel College, Bangalore, and I will be speaking for the motion, environmental damage is inevitable while creating opportunities to pull people out of poverty. Now, an annual average growth rate of 9%, the fastest growing major economy for the past 30 years, and the world leader in reducing poverty, accounting for 76% of the global poverty. A tremendous development of epic proportions by any feat has been attained by the economic juggernaut China. But what is the cost of this development? Well, we have a smog crisis, we have cancer villages, and we have 60 acres of polluted land. The death toll? One dead river, many of which are unaccounted for, and countless lives. You'll agree with me that education, healthcare, industrialization, and agricultural reforms are the crux of development and alleviation of poverty, but they come with their own set of baggage. Developing countries project that they will adhere to the guidelines of sustainable development, but the concept of sustainable development remains a mere rhetoric. Because when limited resources are coupled with the narrow interests of rapid economic development, we have a pollute now, clean later model which we follow. And what we find ourselves doing is sweeping the dirt under the carpet, both literally and figuratively. So poverty coupled with overpopulation puts mayhem by putting a lot of stress on the resources. There are alternate resources or there are renewable sources of energy, but they are not implementable or not very efficient in their implementation because of the high costs and the inconvenience. Simply because we have not yet hit the sweet spot in technological advancement, research and development, and doing so would require a lot of time and money, which does not address the need of the hour, which is immediate relief of destitution. Now, development is a race, and no one wants to come second. So what do? We want more land, more water, more coal, more of everything in large numbers. Irrespective of whether we use or produce something which is renewable, non-renewable, man-made, or natural, all of these are dependent on the earth. The raw materials that go into it, the land we require to carry out the processes, the machines to manufacture these goods are all dependent on the environment, which have adverse consequences on the biodiversity, the abiotic and biotic factors. It causes eutrophication of water bodies and deforestation, just to name a few. And wherever man sets foot, destruction, overexploitation, and degradation is sure to follow. Now, so I can say that economic development and environmental degradation go hand in hand. But the irony of this economic development, which causes environmental damage, is that it threatens to undermine the country's growth, its international standing, and endangers the domestic stability, which is counter-effective to the original goal, which was development. So unfortunately, what happens is that the lower economic strata is the first to be impacted by the tumultuous or the turbulent environment which is caused. And they're also hit the hardest. But ultimately, it is the entire human race which bears the brunt of its own development. Science is science and facts are facts, and when it boils down to it, collateral damage is unavoidable and environmental damage is inevitable for the sake of reducing poverty. Thank you. And if any of you are planning to go to China, I would suggest you use one of these.
On 7th August 1992, little Ramu and his mother burn wood to cook whatever little they have in order to save themselves from dying of hunger. On 15th March 2012, the same Ramu, not so little anymore, and now with a formal degree, urges his family to rely on LPG cylinders and explains to his mother the harmful effects of burning wood for fuel. So how hard is it to take poverty away from all the Ramus and at the same time save the environment just by enlightening them? Good morning, members of the jury. I'm Fatima Hussain from Jamia Millia Islamia, and I will be speaking against the motion before you here today. To better coordinate the process of economic development and environmental conservation, it is vital to understand the links between the two. They can't be viewed as two independent phenomena, as there exists a cause and effect relationship between them. Several regions and communities of the world are trapped in this vicious spiral where poverty pushes people to overexploit the environmental resources to survive each day. The impoverishment of the ecosystem further pushes them deeper into the poverty, making survival an even more difficult task. First and foremost, poor people must be seen as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Efforts to improve environmental management in ways that contribute to sustainable growth and poverty reduction should reflect the priorities of the poor. Supportive policies and institutions are needed, including access to information and decision-making that expand the poor's opportunities to invest in environmental improvements that can enhance their livelihoods. More community-based and localized approaches need to be embraced for the management of natural resources and for sustainable development. Involving local people may also help reduce the negative impacts of demographic, environmental, and economic changes and channelize these processes positively. For instance, the international NGO, Muslim Aid, initiated a general house agricultural project in Bosnia for the internally displaced peoples. This allowed them to become self-sustainable whilst optimally utilizing the fertile landscape of eastern Bosnia. Countries like Switzerland, France, and Germany have been very successful in eradicating poverty and providing their people with a better standard of living, but have never compromised with environmental integrity. The African continent is undergoing changes for the removal of poverty from countries like Nigeria and Uganda. These countries are achieving this with a mindset where people work alongside the environment and not against it. Vietnam is working towards economic progress, but still has large numbers who worship nature. The same goes with Japan. Hence, the same rate of growth in an economy can be associated with widely different environmental impacts. As economies grow, their environmental performance tends to deteriorate or improve considering what variable is considered. For example, water quality tends to improve with rise in income. But if we see environmental pollution from sulfur dioxide, it tends to first get worse with rise in income, but then it declines. These differences are largely a function of a country's policy and regulatory framework and institutional capacity. Secondly, the environmental quality of growth matters to the poor. Environmental improvement is not a luxury preoccupation that can wait until growth has alleviated income poverty, nor can it be assumed that growth itself will take care of environmental problems over the longer term as incomes rise and more resources are available for environmental protection. I would just like to conclude by saying environmental degradation is not inevitable, nor is it the unavoidable consequence of economic growth. On the contrary, sound and equitable environmental management is key to sustained poverty reduction. There are significant policy opportunities to reduce poverty and improve the environment. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anupriya Dhonchak from NLU Delhi. I would be speaking in favor of the motion. This House believes that environmental degradation is inevitable while creating opportunities to pull people out of poverty. I'd begin by contextualizing poverty, then I would talk about dependence of poor people on natural resources, and go on to talk about poverty alleviation through opportunities, and finally talk about the prioritization of human interests over environmental concerns. So poverty is a structural phenomenon, a curse, a vicious cycle that deprives generations together of certain basic amenities. We also need to look at countries that suffer from abject poverty and which require populations to be pulled out of poverty. Such countries depend hugely on natural resources. Overpopulation or scarcity of limited resources compared to the number of mouths to feed is both a cause and effect of poverty. And this leads to immense pressure on land for agricultural requirements, on resources like fuels for the requirements of industry. And so we come to the conclusion that basically whatever sector, be it primary, secondary, or tertiary, it can only be more productive by the degradation of environment, because it will in a way require either the exploitation of natural resources or the development of infrastructure, which in itself requires the exploitation of natural resources. So this is where the point about pulling people out of this structure comes in. Poverty is a concept coterminous with underdevelopment, illiteracy, unemployment, infrastructural deficiencies. And so when we take poverty as the starting point, we also assume with it the lack of development, lack of infrastructure, illiteracy to exist in these societies. And opportunities can't be created out of thin air. That leaves us with only natural resources to capitalize upon for creation of opportunities to pull people out of poverty. Now I'll come to the point of prioritization. When you establish poverty alleviation or human resource development as your primary need, when you prioritize it, environmental concerns automatically become secondary and subjugated in that sense. So following their being pulled out of poverty, environmental concerns may become important to people. However, when they're reeling under abject poverty, their need and response would be the fulfillment of their basic requirements. And they wouldn't be worried too much about environmental concerns then. So very simply put, for example, if we need more schools because our population is illiterate, or more factories because our population is unemployed, we will not account too much for our greenhouse gas emissions. And our primary concern after we've established our priority of pulling people out of poverty would be to ensure that our population is educated and therefore employed and therefore able to sustain themselves. So my right to a clean environment is a part of my right to life. But when my right to life is threatened in the very narrow sense, in the sense that I can't sustain myself, my right to clean environment then is not of much importance to me. And that's where human concerns become much more important than environmental concerns. And also, we may talk, I might be rebutted by arguments for cleaner sources of energy. We need to look into the fact that when we're talking about alternate resources or cleaner sources, we only show that the degree of degradation is less. But this debate is about the inevitability of degradation. So environmental degradation due to overexploitation or overusage of natural resources is going to happen inevitably because those resources are limited in nature, though it might happen to varying degrees. Therefore, we conclude that a poverty-ridden country operates within economic and infrastructural limitations to pull people out of poverty. And it requires that the environment be put to whatever use possible for pulling people out of poverty to serve human interests and to create opportunities, that is, to create goods for consumption or for production, or to create infrastructure for services, to serve the very basic requirements of people. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Danish Kaushal. I'm from Hindu College, and the motion I'll be arguing on is that environmental degradation is inevitable in order to create more opportunities to pull people out of poverty. I'll be going against the motion. So basically, first of all, what we must understand is that poverty, in a way, is the direct result of unemployment, because people who are actually employed are protected from poverty through various minimum wage laws and all of that, etc. So the point of that being, to create more economic opportunities, you have to create more employment. So to create more employment, and I'll go into the basic economics here, first of all, the first method is to increase production. So how do you increase production? Is that by increasing scale. Increasing scale means employing more factors of production. So the 4 factors of production basically are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. But the problem right now is for a new production unit to be actually opened, land is required more than the other factors of production as such, because the other factors of production can only be employed once land is there. And land is actually a finite resource. So the problem right there is that in order to get more land, you have to cut down those forest areas, which is directly deforestation, which is directly environmental degradation as such. So the point of that being to increase the scale of production and to employ more factors of production, this kind of environmental degradation is inevitable. And even if we were to accept the premise that environmental damage can be minimized by efforts focused by the industries as such on recoveries and also reversing the effects of deforestation as such, you cannot argue against the fact that environmental degradation is inevitable, even though the degrees of it can vary. The second way in which economic opportunities can be generated is by increasing productivity, which is again by employing machinery and all that stuff. So the problem with that is, first of all, that most industries right now, like the combination of machinery and labor, most industries which use that right now actually use conventional sources of energy to get more energy as such, and those conventional sources of energy actually lead to a lot of pollution, greenhouse emissions, greenhouse gases and emissions and all of that stuff. And so even if it is accepted that there's newer technologies and newer machineries which actually lead to lesser pollution as such, first of all, the problem with that is that the replacement process of actually replacing the conventional machinery and the conventional sources of energy with newer technology and newer sources of energy is actually very costly right now. It is understood right now that cleaner energy and cleaner sources of energy are actually more costly, and mostly developing countries as such and industries in developing countries do not have that kind of capital right now to actually replace the conventional sources of energy and conventional sources of conventional machinery with newer sources of energy and non-conventional machinery as such. My third argument would focus on a particular strata as such. Coming back to my last argument, there is a rebuttal to that there are newer sources of energy and better technology as such. But the problem with that is that when you mitigate the demand for the conventional sources of energy, you destroy a singular industry as such, that is the conventional energy sector as such. So the problem with that is that it actually decreases the economic opportunity available to people rather than increasing it. And if you need a statistic to show how bad that is, every 1% that unemployment goes up, 40,000 people die. And you cannot argue that somehow the lives of each and every one of those people who died is actually somehow less valuable than the abstract idea of environmental protection. So summing up all of my arguments as such, at the most basic level, protecting human life is much more important right now. I'll tell you why I say that. A lack of economic opportunity means that people have no income, people have no money. If people have no money, people have no food. And if people have no food, that just directly results in no life as such. So a person who hasn't had a proper meal for more than 3 days or weeks or months doesn't really care about the environment as such. And the very objective and essence of environmental protection is to give a better standard of living and to the future generations and to ourselves as well. But is that actually achieved by letting people die right now? It just doesn't make sense. In this context, the short term is actually more valuable than the long term as such, because we don't have any other alternatives as such.
Good afternoon, I'm Rohan Mishra from Hindu College, and I'll be speaking against the motion. Now, poverty is a complex, deep-seated, pervasive reality. It is a nightmare that breeds a growing sense of powerlessness and indignity, of being unable to think, plan, or dream beyond the daily struggle to survive. It hinders growth, fuels instability, and keeps poor countries from advancing on the path to sustainable development. For all of us, the cost of poverty in shattered human lives is far too high. To truly be sustainable, poverty alleviation programs need to be environment friendly. The brunt of environmental damage is almost inevitably shared by the poorest of the poor. So while the bourgeois in Beijing goes ahead and gets air purifiers in their house to keep out the air pollution, the poorest of the poor keep breathing in that toxic air, which adversely affects their mental and physical capacities. They often contract diseases like bronchitis or lung cancer, which disables them from going to work and condemns them to a life of poverty, misery, and disease. When we go ahead and indiscriminately cut down the rainforests of the Amazon, we go ahead and displace the major tribal communities that live there, endangering their way of life And really, how is this good for them? You're endangering their way of life. When we go ahead and pollute our soil, we make farmlands barren, therefore destroying livelihoods that depend on these farmlands. When we go ahead and adopt measures which aren't environment friendly, we fuel climate change and global warming. And let me tell you, disasters caused by environmental change and global warming, such as hurricanes, such as the Katrina hurricane or the submersion of the Mauritius Islands, ravage developing countries the most and claim lives. They condemn poor people to be poor. These are the natural disasters which are a major driving force in the bad condition that these poor people have. If we go ahead and say that we're fine with environmental damage to alleviate poverty, we say that we're fine with unsustainable consumption and production patterns that result in huge economic and social costs. Believing that environmental damage is inevitable while creating opportunities to pull people out of poverty is like admitting to defeat without even trying to solve the problem. If we want to continue living in this planet, we have to remove poverty without damaging it. The challenge here is to champion development of environmental-friendly technology and growth, enabling societies to live sustainably. Now understand, when side opposition comes in ahead and tells you that we're fine with the poverty alleviation, and even if it harms the environment, so what? They necessarily go ahead and pass a value judgment over the development of environmentally friendly technologies, which is a major problem that I have with their case. Poverty alleviation does not require earth-shattering, environmental-destroying technology. Economic liberalization is the need of the hour. This can be achieved by extending property rights to the poor through technology, like mobile banking. I agree with side opposition when they come ahead and tell us that infrastructure is very fundamental to alleviating poverty. However, they make this blatant assumption that infrastructure means environmental degradation, which is necessarily wrong. With technology, anything is possible. Companies like Tesla are working towards giving us roads and roofs with integrated solar panels, solving the energy crisis and giving us better infrastructure while being environmentally friendly. 3/4 of the poor today are farmers. In South Asia, cereal production rose by 137% from 1970 to 2007. This was made possible with only 3% more land. Better technology made this huge revolution possible. To conclude, I'd just like to say that sustainable development is the need of the hour. Development or poverty alleviation at that should never come at the cost of the environment. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, congratulations everybody for making it here to the top 30. We actually had hundreds of students, I was about to say kids, which are not clearly by the quality of your arguments. Hundreds participate from the 12 or 13 cities that we travel to. First of all, congratulations to all of you who made it here. And I'm now going to announce the names of the 6 who will make it to the next round. The quality of arguments was by and large pretty good, and all the judges were very impressed with the wisdom way beyond your years of many of you. I must say personally, I was a little disappointed by some of you taking hearsay and rumors as fact. And as responsible debaters, that is not something you do. There were 3 specific instances that I saw where stuff was quoted that is true, I know for a fact that's which is untrue, and data that is untrue that was quoted. So as debaters, if you want to be taken seriously, you must make sure when you state something, you can 100% back it with facts. Unless you are saying it's an opinion, which is fine. But when you state something as fact, it better be fact, because then at least I slash points. You can't just make up stuff. So the 6 who will be competing the next round, and you have very accomplished lot of judges for that. There's Madhu Trehan, the founder of India Today, TV Today, and of Newslaundry. Tanmay Bhatt, the co-founder of All India Bakchod, and Manvi Sinha, who is the managing editor of NDTV Profit. So yeah, those of you who will be debating in the next round are Sateja Paradkar from BITS, Hyderabad. Zoe Bedi, did I get that right? Ashoka University. Fatima Syed Hussain, is that right? Jamia. Anmol Mittal, is that right? Okay, Anmol Mittal. Rohan Mishra from Hindu, Delhi. And Gibran Mansoor from Ashoka University, is that right? You have 20 minutes to prepare before we reconvene. Thank you all, and thanks again.